My name is Bauer, and I welcome you to the launch of the Biennial Reader that has been published by Bergen Kunsthall and Hans publishers in Germany. And thank you for coming on a Sunday afternoon. Bear with us, I need already my notes on a computer to be on top of that. I want to quickly introduce also the speakers. Solveig Øvstebø co-organized the Bergen Biennial Conference together with Elena, Filipovic and Marieke in 2009, and together they edited the Biennial Reader that we launched today here, which is the first anthology on large-scale perennial exhibitions of contemporary art. And this book will be, with no doubt, a source book for critical studies of the global biennial phenomena that took off in the 90s and shifted indeed paradigms of discussing art, its conditions of production, and its social-political situatedness. I had the pleasure to moderate a session at the Biennial Conference, and I can state firsthand that this conference brought together scholars and practitioners, curators of biennales in various parts of the world to have a really intense debate and a serious reflection on this phenomena, also open it up to more scholarly work. Advocates of biennials discussed why biennials have such an impact, followed by voices that raise doubts and questions, and actually also indicating the trap of lacking experience, funding, and infrastructure sometimes. For 3 days, several hundred people, both local and international, soon realized that the phenomena of more than 150 biennials taking place around the globe had not only put a discussion on biennials as a new format on the map, but also had an impact on the art scenes, art institutions, and how artists operate today. It's indeed time for a deeper analysis and critical reflection, but also the need for scholarly work became quite obvious. I would also like to use the opportunity to thank the municipality of Bergen for their support, not only for the conference and this first comprehensive reader on the topic, but also we are grateful for their support of today's event. I want to acknowledge also the Mondrian Foundation and the Norwegian Embassy in the US for their support. And of course, we want to thank Basel for having us here. Now let me introduce the 3 women, and I'm actually really proud to introduce once a panel of several women here, which after this morning session still seem not so natural. So really, it's great to have you here. And I start with Solveig Øvstebø, who is the director of the Kunsthall Bergen since 2003, that she developed actually into one of the main art institutions in Norway with a focus on contemporary art and its production, research, and discourse. She did her postgraduate studies in art history at the University of Bergen. Her curatorial work include exhibitions of Christopher Williams, Looking is Political, Nari Baragian, Bojan Sarcevic, and Anne Hjort Gutu, Sergej Jensen, etc. I hope you can have the chance to look her up more. She also is in charge of the annual Festspiel exhibition, which is a very crucial show in the history of Norwegian artists and is usually equally to the Venice Biennial contribution. Øvstebø has also taught theory and art history at the art academies of Helsinki and Bergen and has written and lectured extensively on contemporary art. She's also a board member of the Arts Council of Norway. Marieke in the middle is the founding director of the Biennial Foundation, that is a new non-profit organization facilitating biennial organizations worldwide by providing a platform for exchange, collaboration, and research. Van Haal was the director of the first Athens Biennial that took place in 2007, for which she initiated the European Biennial Network. She was also the general coordinator of the Manifesta Foundation, situated in Amsterdam, and managing editor of the first series of the Manifesta journal in collaboration with Victor Misiano and the late Igor Zabel. As an art history graduate, Marieke van Haal is pursuing a research degree in curating contemporary art at the Royal College of Art in London, and she has, of course, lectured extensively on the topic on biennials and their history. And Elena Filipovic is currently curator at Wiels Contemporary Art Center in Brussels. She co-curated with Adam Simchik the 5th Berlin Biennial, When Things Cast No Shadow, and she co-edited the Manifesta Decade, Debates on Contemporary Art, Exhibitions and Biennials in Post-War Europe in 2006. Her recent exhibitions include the first major solo exhibition of Marcel Duchamp's work in Latin America at the Museo de Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo and the Fundació Proa in Buenos Aires, and most recently, a retrospective of Felix González Torres. Specific objects without specific form at Wiels and other venues in Europe, and the Felix González Torres show, it was just at Fundació Bauer, I understood, and moves on to the Museum of Modern Art in Frankfurt. She is a tutor for exhibition history at the Apple Postgraduate Curatorial Training Program and an advisor for the Rijksacademie, and both in Amsterdam. So let us welcome our speakers. Yeah, and I want to start first with, like, you basically, the three of you bring very different perspectives on the discussion on biennials, and you also had different point of departures, and it would be interesting to hear, like, how the three of you came together, not only to do the conference, but also basically come to the decision to start with this book, which is indeed very needed and very welcome. So maybe Solveig, as you started a conference, you give your insight.
Well, the whole thing actually started with this politician in Bergen that decided to launch the idea of having a biennial in Bergen. Now, that was, of course, for the art environment or the art society in Bergen, that was good news in a way, because this is a politician. We're not used to politicians being so honestly engaged and enthusiastic about contemporary art. At the same time, we became a little bit afraid about this enthusiasm about the biennial in Bergen. And when the municipality approached Bergen Kunsthall and asked if we could be the ranger or the one that actually took this biennial and started that first biennial, we started a dialogue with the municipality, and we encouraged them to instead do the biennial immediately, to stop up for a moment and reflect on the phenomenon. And only also because we all wanted to learn more about this, not to dismiss the whole idea, but simply because we needed more knowledge about the format, about what would be relevant for Bergen, a city in Norway, conservative city. What would be the relevant format for this city? And surprisingly, but also impressively, I think that the municipality then said yes. They said yes to a conference instead of sculptures in the park, and actually agreed to make a biennial conference and also a book. So all the way it was a plan to make a book after the proceedings of the conference. And in this work, then when that was settled, we invited along two scholars in the field, Elena Filipovic and Marieke whom I never met before and I didn't know anything about, only their writings and their CVs. And we started this very fruitful collaboration to then present this conference. And during this work, we also saw, because initially we didn't know that there was this lack of theory and of compiled and anthology about the biennial. So initially we actually thought we would make these proceedings of the conference. And then while we were working, we saw the need for a bigger book about this phenomenon. And then we started to do a more in-depth research and collect text and also invite new writers to participate.
But Marieke and Elena, you have been engaged with biennials from two different perspectives. Marieke, you mainly also from working on the infrastructure, being an organizer, being a director of a biennial, and you, Elena, being engaged as a curator of a biennial. So I think these are two very different point of departures, and like maybe if you could say your take, like you reading also, of course, knowing the field quite well.
Well, of course, I had a lot of practical experience with Manifesta, working in different cities to produce this biennial, and as well as setting up this new biennial in Athens in 2007. But at the same time, when Solveig called me, I was really lacking a kind of more in-depth understanding of the field I was working in, and I was starting my research at the Royal College of Art, and understanding the debate, which was quite black and white. I understood on the biennial. Either there were the optimists that see the biennial as a model for discourse, like activating the artistic discourse in a certain place, having this flexible character, being alternative, and at the other side, the critical notions on the biennial, with ideas that the biennial would be obsolete. There are too many already existing. They are have become products of city marketing, etc. So basically I was interested, and while I was reading basically about the context I was working in, I realized there is hardly any resource, handbook or collection of texts available that kind of contextualize our field of practice and understand. And so I think when Solveig approached us and we were talking about this idea of a biennial in Bergen, we all acknowledged that it was time for a pause and reflection and a much more in-depth consideration of the biennial as an exhibition model. So therefore, and of course the city was very open to our thoughts and our ideas, not to jump immediately into this spectacular event, but take the time with us and have this like really in-depth discussion that was necessary, we felt at the time, and also to produce this book, which hopefully not only serves, and this is what we kind of understood from the comments, not only serves the doubts which the city of Bergen had, but which might be fruitful for and valuable for many cities, and also art practitioners, curators, and artists worldwide, as well as scholars.
But Elena, you worked on the Berlin Biennial, and you also faced what many curators of biennials face, actually, like it's short time. Very often there is no institutional space. You have to look for the locations. So it's a lot of, it's a very different way of curating than if you go into an institution. So what was your experience? And like also you decided, for example, like to have every night a program, so not focusing just of the opening of the biennial, and so to really already put a critical reflection of experiences with other biennials into place.
I mean, the funny thing about being a curator who also happened to have the incredible luxury, the opportunity, and the challenge of making a biennial is you realize there is no handbook out there to tell you what you're supposed to do, because it's a very different experience than working in an institution or working freelance as I had done, or working as an art historian or theorist. On the one hand, there is no handbook, but there was no place that gathered together a history for what this thing that we all call a biennial is. And we even asked ourselves the question, can we speak about the biennial, like it's one thing, when in fact there are so many, and the differences between a new biennial in Kazakhstan and the Venice Biennial, which has such a long history and such an important reputation, they're so different in terms of funding, in terms of audience, in terms of what they want to do. So it seemed really important to bring together existing knowledge, to bring together texts that that each of us were in some way reading as part of our interest in the history of biennials, but that had never been gathered together. I could say that I wish I'd had the biennial reader before I made the Berlin Biennial. I don't know if it would have changed anything, but indeed, when you're working on a biennial project, I think it can be useful, and not just for future biennial curators, but it can be useful to understand the complexity and the history of the institution that you're dealing with. I think that was definitely one of our goals, also to be able to say, if the history of art, and I was trained as a kind of classical art historian, has been a history that's always told through objects, autonomous objects that sit in a room and you walk around. But there's something about the context in which they've been shown that was left out of that history. And it had been started already since the 80s. Here and there books have come out, but it hadn't radically changed the way the narrative of art history was being written, and certainly biennials almost fell out of this history altogether. So for us, this was an attempt, and I see myself really as someone with one foot in theory and one foot, as a practicing curator, to bring these two worlds together and the problems of each of them together, and to, in a way, we think of it as a handbook. We thought a lot about the title also, the biennial reader, something that would be really straightforward and would, be what it says. So in that way, yes, a handbook.
But if one talks about biennials, there's of course the classical history, like the Venice Biennale, then Sao Paulo came, then Sydney came, and these were the big biennials, bringing art like that was new in the recent years to different parts of the globe. But in the 90s, basically, there is really a paradigm shift. And what could say that, and correct me if I'm wrong from my assumption, that to get introduced to younger and new art, you either had the art fairs that suddenly franchised, or you had the biennials. So suddenly there were two models where you could discover kind of younger, new art. And also, I think there's an interesting section about the globalization. And you want to comment on that a little bit? Like how you basically also structured all of this knowledge that is so diverse.
I think what you're mentioning about, let's say, the genesis of the Biennale, or this notion of Venice and the older biennales as well as the contemporary art biennial is an important point. Is something we found out doing our research, is that the historiography of the Biennale has yet to be written. So it's interesting, what you see in the book is that scholars still seem to disagree or contest each other's notions of what is that exact origin of the Biennale. I mean, there are general acknowledgements that it's the World Exhibition that led to Venice Biennale, but there is an interesting text, for instance, by Rafał Niemojewski, a young scholar at the Royal College of Art, who just graduated with the title "Venice or Havana: A Polemic on the History of the Biennale," and that's a very important text, I think. Where, of course, we all know that the biennial since the 90s has become such a popular phenomenon and cannot be compared with Venice. So that's some of the outcomes of the research.
And what we also did in the beginning, when we started to work with the conference, was what we sent out this e-flux with a call for knowledge that was sent all over the world, and we started to ask people we know and people all over the world started to send in what they have written, and also this information or text or theory that we then gathered, we tried to make in sections in the book, and not only like the present biennial or the curatorial, but also the historiography and the history, and where we also start with the world exhibitions, linking it to those with Caroline Jones, and therefore we take it through different steps and all these implications that is leading into the biennial, and also discussing the institutional aspects of the biennial and how the institution is inspired and also influenced by the biennial and vice versa. Because now you also see that institutions somehow take upon this kind of radical role of the biennial, and then again you see biennial that are more institutionalized than those institutions. So it's this dialogue between the two also.
Elena,
Well, I think Solveig brought up an important point about a starting point for thinking about this book. I mean, we kind of started quite modestly with the idea that we couldn't possibly already know all the texts that were out there written about biennials. So we kind of contacted colleagues all over the world and asked them to contact colleagues in this kind of idea of 6 degrees of separation that would connect us to the world, and said, if there's any text in any language from any part of the world that discusses analytically the history or the phenomenon of biennials, we'd like to know about it. We'll translate it and we'll consider it. And quite a number of those texts actually made it into the book. But they start from the position that from where we're standing, we may not know everything that there is out there, and that there may be scholars in Asia or Latin America or parts where we don't know what's happening with the scholarship as well as we may know in our own native territories. And we were quite interested to find out that there are people thinking in very different parts of the world, and to present them from their position. So to have an African scholar who's worked on the history of the Dakar Biennial talk about that particular history, and and to have a text translated for the first time, and we did that in a number of cases. But I think this connects to Uta, your question about globalization and how ever since the advent of globalization, we think the whole world has become one and everything is connected. But one of the things we found out in the research of this is, in fact, we don't know what's out there necessarily. And the biennials and art fairs indeed might give you the impression that you can see the whole world in 2 days or a day and a half. But it's maybe a false impression, and there's a lot out there that's being missed. So If the history of art is to be a truly global history, and if the advent of biennials is meant to be the truly global phenomenon that they claim to be, well, their history should also be as equally international and wide-reaching. So we tried to do this.
So whom did you had in mind when you basically were not only doing the conference, but specifically when you were editing the book? I mean, like as your readership, and like also how do you, as you were speaking about globalization, how do you get that book beyond the Western world who has a distribution system for such readers?
Good question.
Good question. Depending a little bit on support funding, so we need more funding to get it out there. But we have the municipality now, also in Bergen, again, impressively giving us a funding for sending it to the biennials all over the world. And as long as that budget reaches, it will be sent. And
university libraries.
Yes, university library, and of course students and practitioners, artists, scholars. I mean, this is a book that could be read by many. There are different type of texts, but most of them are like based in the research, and the point of departure for the conference was research, and this is also the basis for the book.
Because I mean, one has to acknowledge that, like, of course we always say there is not enough art, there's not enough support for the arts, but one has to say there is more venues for the arts than ever. We have more curators, curatorial schools than ever. And of course, this cannot be separated from the history and the phenomena of the increasing numbers also of biennials in the world. And like, what is kind of the take that you have after basically also reading everything that is in the book?
Well, I think one thing we were really surprised to discover, or at least I definitely was, that how polemic the debate is about biennials, in fact, and how much this polemic of people either for them, saying they're experimental, they're necessary, they're incredible platforms, discursive, adventurous in their programming, much more than the inertia of, let's say, institutions which move more slowly and can't respond. That's one side. And the other side that was, associating them with the worst qualities of Disneyland, Olympics, art fairs even, but saying that they weren't really about art showing and sensitivity, but about spectacle. That was the other side. And for both of these sides, they kind of close down debate, because either if you think it's a fantastic thing, there's no reason to really question it, and if you think it's a terrible thing, there's no reason to talk any more about it. So we wanted to bring both sides together and to say, this is a phenomenon that whether we like it or we don't like it, we have to take seriously. It exists, and it's radically changed the way contemporary art is being shown, distributed, talked about, seen. And I think that's what this book wanted to do, to not position ourselves on one side or the other of the debate, but to really equally present all sides, and to be able to say, this needs to be taken seriously in art history for all the people that we mentioned, but also for future generations of artists, of curators, of art lovers, to think about this quite important platform for showing art.
I think it's also important to acknowledge maybe what we found out. I mean, as Elena said, it's a catalyst. And the book is just there to, stimulate further debate on this phenomenon, the Biennale. But also some of the findings I think we did. I mean, for instance, we had one specific question: did biennials influence art production, or the kind of art that has been produced, let's say since the 90s, or did art change the exhibition models, let's say, which maybe became the biennial? So there are also topics that I think we try to dig into, but that need much more further research.
For example?
Well, this question: is there such thing as biennial art? I mean, I'm just posing one. There's many. I think there's more questions than answers given by this book, but it's a stimulus for further investigation and examination.
Yeah, because we were discussing also like that, of course, in the past, I mean, it's a fairly young phenomena also that there are PhDs on contemporary art. Until like about 20 years ago, it was very difficult to find a PhD reader for a contemporary dissertation, dissertation on contemporary art, but now you come with the history of exhibitions. I mean, you're an art historian. How do you see that?
I think it acknowledges that there has been a shift also in art history programs, that, as you say, now for the last 20 years, students can do PhDs on contemporary art. And then the next logical step is to also say, maybe these PhDs on the history of art shouldn't just be about the history of the object itself, but to really think in terms of the exhibition context. The biennial being one of many, but an important one if we think about the way contemporary art is shown today. It's given that there's so many of them, one can't deny that they have had some impact on the way that contemporary art is made and shown. And if that's the case, then this might be a stimulus for graduate art programs to, allow students to, think more about the exhibition context in which works are shown.
And I think it's important to mention that the people who have contributed are from both the academic and the practical worlds, which hardly come together. And it's also something we try to do with our conference, to invite academics as well as practitioners. Because the discussions so far, which I attended throughout the years, and many of us at biennials, they're usually by the practitioners themselves, who maybe cannot be so critical upon their own biennale they just opened, probably. So it was very important to try to bridge this gap between the scholarly world and the practical, the world of practice. So you have texts by professors as well as young scholars, as well as artists and curators. And I think to bring these both professions and perspectives on contemporary art and on this biennale phenomenon, as you may call it, together, was important, I think. Yeah.
It's quite a solid coffee table book. So, how did you break it down? Obviously you had to make a structure for the book. So, what are the key kind of structures that you used to organize the texts?
In the beginning, we started a little bit out with the same structure as they had for the conference. Actually, we started the conference with 3 very easy kind of themes: history, practice, and future. And then, when having all the text or the lectures in writing from the conference, then we saw that there were so many implications. They had a curatorial that was repeatedly coming up as a theme, so we put that as a block. And then we also wanted to elaborate on the history, so that became one of the main chapters. And of course, the global issue. So we basically read through the text, and we sort of found those themes or elements that could be linked together, and we tried to organize the text as such. But they're not chronological or...
As well as there's some essays that really dig into, let's say, the history or the evolution of one certain biennale. For instance, yes. Dakar, which was, very little information was is spread out on this biennale, or Havana, or Guangzhou, or Sao Paulo. So there's also a few, or Documenta even though it's not necessarily a biennial. But apart from these general themes, there are also some texts that really go deeper into one specific.
And I should say as well that a big part of the book are these new commissioned essays that emerge from the conference, but also, I guess at least half of it is as well seminal existing texts. So we brought together texts from basically the 60s to the 90s, texts that had been written about, analytic texts about the biennial phenomenon, but that were in some cases out of print, difficult to find, or that simply had never been gathered in a single place. The idea being that, even our ideas for this book and for thinking about the biennial didn't arrive ex nihilo. They come out of themselves, out of a history, and out of trying to find these texts as practitioners and people interested in biennials. We had trouble also, having access to some of these. So we wanted to have one book that would really be anthological in proper sense of the term, and bring together, and acknowledge that this history, began in a way in the 60s, but it was just a kind of one shot in the dark that, then took 20 more years before there was another text, and then another.
As we only have a very short time to basically discuss that, before we close down, I also wanted to ask you what came up like reading all of this text or gathering all of this text that you had not expected?
I think that I have to repeat what Elena says about the polemical. I would have expected that there would be more neutral text about the phenomenon, but it's very polemical. And this is very surprising, actually, after so long with so many biennials.
Yeah, and that no neat lineages can be drawn on the origin of the Biennale. That, for me, that was the most striking. The Biennale exists since 1895, and apparently we're still not clear about the exact history of the Biennale as a, and maybe there is not, and that's interesting, and that sort of indicates that a lot of further examination can be done. And this is also the title of our editorial essay. It's called Bienniology, in which we kind of ask for further studies on this exhibition model.
And history.
I mean, to end that, I could just say that, one of the things I was quite surprised about was how much for people still today that have worked on biennials or are thinking about biennials, the word biennial is still something that's quite open in terms of what it can be, that it could be a completely discursive event. We all know that, we may know that the 29th Sao Paulo Biennial, the so-called Biennial of the Void, was one that tried to at first, or announced for a moment, that it might entirely get rid of art and make a biennial that would be more about discourse and discussing the biennial itself. And in the end, the thematic was changed a bit, but it shows that the word biennial is extremely open and is maybe something completely freed of any kind of material determinant. That it can be an exhibition, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one. And that once it's an exhibition, we're all not so clear, and even many of the writers were not so clear on what we mean by what an exhibition is, that even that can be very many different things. And so in some way, if institutions have been places where they've long had a tradition of preserving art, of maintaining a certain story about art, the biennials could be a place, and maybe this is the hope we might have for them, a place where there's even more experimentation about what a biennial could be, what even an exhibition could be.
I think to conclude, one could maybe say that the biennial is basically a format that continuously has to reinvent itself. So this is why I thought it's so stunning, even to make a reader about something that hardly can be grasped. And we didn't plan to silence you, but rather the plan is to invite you all over to the, how is it called? The
Botanical Garden.
The Botanical Garden for some drink, some snacks, if you have the time. And then you have the chance also to talk with Elena, Solveig, and Marieke a little bit more in depth. And also please have a look to the book. As an educator and teacher, I know that this is really a crucial source book, and it might take a while until another one comes out. So please have a look and join us for some drinks and some time in the garden. And thank you all for coming, and thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Super.